My best mate of 23 years looked me in the eye over a pint at our usual spot on Beach Road and told me he'd been shagging my girlfriend for 11 months. 11 months. Nearly the entire time I'd been with her. I didn't hit him. I wanted to. God knows I wanted to. But I just sat there, frozen, watching his mouth move, hearing words that didn't make sense. The worst part? He said he was telling me because he felt guilty, because our friendship meant too much to him, as if confessing somehow made it better, as if honesty after a year of lies was supposed to earn him points for integrity. I'm Cornelius Davenport, 59 years old. I own 3 rental properties back in Manchester and a small import-export business that runs itself these days. I moved to Pattaya 6 years ago after my divorce was finalized. Clean break from England, from the cold, from a marriage that had died years before we signed the papers. Thailand was supposed to be my fresh start. Warm weather, low cost of living, no drama. I'd built a good life here, made friends in the expat community, found my rhythm. And then I met Achara. This was March of 2023. I was at a bar in Soi Buakhao, not one of the big tourist traps, but a smaller place where the girls actually talk to you like human beings. Achara was behind the bar, mixing drinks, laughing with customers. 27 years old, from somewhere up in Isan, though she'd been working in Pattaya for 5 years by then. She was beautiful, obviously. Long black hair, bright smile, curves in all the right places. But what caught my attention was how she handled herself. Confident, not desperate, like some of the younger girls who clung to every farang who walked through the door. She had this way of making you feel like she was choosing to talk to you, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. We chatted that first night for maybe 20 minutes. Nothing heavy. She asked where I was from, what brought me to Thailand, how long I'd been here. I told her about my businesses, about loving the weather, about being divorced. She laughed at my jokes, touched my arm when she spoke. The usual bar girl routine, I thought. But then I came back 3 nights later, and she remembered my name. Remembered I drank Singa, not Chang, asked how my week had been. That got my attention. Most of them couldn't remember your name 5 minutes after you left. I started going to that bar 2-3 times a week, just to talk to her. I wasn't looking for anything serious. I'd done serious. I'd done marriage and mortgage and the whole domestic routine. This was just meant to be fun. Easy. But she made it so easy to fall for her. The way she'd light up when I walked in. The way she'd lean over the bar when we talked, giving me her full attention, even when the place was busy. She told me about her family, her younger sister still in school, her mother who wasn't well. She asked about my life, seemed genuinely interested in my stories. After a month of this, I asked her if she'd like to have dinner with me. Somewhere nice, not bar-related. She said yes immediately. That first proper date was in late April. I took her to a seafood restaurant overlooking the beach. She wore a blue dress that made her look absolutely stunning. We talked for 3 hours. She told me she was tired of working in bars, that she wanted something different, something stable. She said most Farangs just wanted one thing, but I seemed different, more respectful, more interested in her as a person. I ate that up. Of course I did. Every man wants to believe he's not like the others, that he's special, that when she says those things to him, she actually means it. We started seeing each other regularly after that. She'd come over to my condo after her shifts, stay the night, leave in the morning. The sex was incredible, enthusiastic, frequent, adventurous. She'd curl up against me afterward, trace patterns on my chest, tell me how safe she felt with me, how different I was from the Thai men she'd dated before, how most Farangs treated bar girls like prostitutes. But I treated her like a girlfriend, like someone who mattered. Every word was designed to hook me deeper, and it worked. My mate Graham had been in Pattaya almost as long as I had. We'd met at a pub quiz night at an expat bar about 5 years earlier, hit it off immediately. Both British, both divorced, both running businesses remotely. We'd watch football together, grab dinner a few times a week, complain about the same things every expat complains about: visa runs, the heat, the traffic. He was one of those guys who seemed to have it all figured out. Confident, always had a story, always knew the best places to eat or drink, never seemed lonely or lost like some of the older guys you see wandering around Pattaya looking desperate. I trusted him. Completely. The kind of trust you only have with someone you've known for years. Someone who'd seen you at your worst and stuck around anyway. I introduced Graham to Achara in June, about 3 months after we'd started dating. We were at a restaurant in Naklua, and I'd invited him to join us. I was proud to show her off, honestly. Look at this beautiful young woman who's chosen to be with me. Graham was charming as always, asked her questions about herself, made her laugh. She was a bit quiet at first, but then she warmed up. By the end of the meal, they were joking around like they'd known each other for years. Graham told me afterward that she seemed great, that I'd lucked out. Said most bar girls would have cleaned out my bank account by now. He was happy for me. Or so I thought. After that first meeting, the three of us started spending more time together. Graham would join us for dinners, or we'd meet him for drinks. Achara said she liked him, that he was funny. I thought it was perfect. My girlfriend getting along with my best mate. It felt like proof that my life in Thailand was working out. That I'd built something real here. Something better than what I'd left behind in Manchester. By August, Achara had moved into my condo. It happened gradually, naturally. She'd stay over more nights than not. Started keeping clothes and toiletries at my place. Stopped going back to her own apartment. When her lease came up for renewal, I suggested she just move in officially. Save the rent money, I said. She could use it to send more back to her family. She cried when I suggested it, said I was too good to her, said she'd never been with a man who took care of her like this. We celebrated that night with champagne and the best sex we'd ever had. I remember lying there afterward, her head on my chest, thinking I'd finally gotten it right. Finally found what I'd been looking for. That's when things started to shift. Small things at first. She'd be on her phone more often, texting someone and smiling at the screen. When I'd ask who she was talking to, she'd say friends from the bar or her sister. Nothing unusual. But then she started going out more. Lunches with friends, shopping trips, visits to the salon that took hours longer than they used to. She was still affectionate with me, still having sex regularly, still saying she loved me. But there was a distance that hadn't been there before, like part of her was somewhere else. Graham started acting different too. He'd cancel plans with me last minute, saying he had work to catch up on or wasn't feeling well. When we did meet up, he seemed distracted, on edge. He'd ask about Achara, how things were going with us, but in a way that felt forced. Like he was fishing for information. I didn't think much of it at the time. People go through phases. Maybe he was having his own issues. Maybe he was jealous that I had a girlfriend and he was still playing the field. I actually felt a bit sorry for him. In September, I started noticing her phone habits had changed. She'd always been fairly open with her phone before, leaving it on the table, not worrying if I saw notifications. But now she kept it face down everywhere. Took it to the bathroom with her. Started locking it with a password when she'd never had one before. When I asked about it, she said she'd had problems with someone trying to hack her Facebook account, so she was being more careful with security. Made sense. I let it go. One afternoon in late September, I came home early from a meeting that had been canceled. Achara was supposed to be out shopping with her friend Molly. But when I walked into the condo, I could hear her on the phone in the bedroom, speaking Thai, which wasn't unusual, but her tone was different, softer, almost flirtatious. I stood in the hallway, listening. I couldn't understand most of what she was saying, but I caught a few words. Ruck, which means love, and a name. Repeated several times. It sounded like Graham. But that didn't make sense. Why would she be talking to Graham? And why would she sound like that? When she came out and saw me, she jumped. Actually jumped, like I'd caught her doing something wrong. She quickly said she'd been talking to Molly, that she'd just gotten home herself. But she was flustered, and she was lying. I knew she was lying, but I didn't want to believe it. So I did what most men do when they don't want to face something. I convinced myself I'd misheard, that I was being paranoid, that there was a perfectly reasonable explanation. October brought more of the same. More phone secrecy, more unexplained absences, more times when she'd say she was going one place, and I'd find out later she'd been somewhere else. Once I called her when she said she was at the market, and I could hear bar music in the background. When I mentioned it, she said, there was a bar next to the market playing loud music. Could have been true. Probably was true. But the way she explained it, too quickly, too defensively, made me doubt her. Graham and I were seeing less of each other, maybe once a week instead of 3 or 4 times. He always had excuses. Work was busy, he was tired. He'd made other plans. When we did meet up, he couldn't look me in the eye. Kept checking his phone. Would steer conversations away from Achara whenever I brought her up. I started to wonder if maybe he'd seen something, if maybe he knew something he didn't want to tell me. But I didn't ask, because asking meant admitting there might be something to know. The sex had changed, too. It wasn't less frequent, exactly, but it was different. She was more mechanical about it, going through the motions. She'd still initiate sometimes, but it felt perfunctory, like she was fulfilling an obligation. And afterward, she wouldn't curl up against me anymore. She'd roll over, check her phone, or say she needed to shower. The intimacy was gone. The connection we'd had. I was just a body to her, a wallet with a pulse. In early November, I ran into one of the girls who worked at Achara's old bar. She was clearly uncomfortable seeing me, tried to make an excuse to leave quickly. But I asked how she'd been, made small talk, and eventually asked if she'd seen much of Achara lately. She got this look on her face, pity mixed with discomfort. She said she'd seen Achara around, at different bars, with different men, always farangs. She said it carefully, like she wasn't sure if I knew. Like maybe this was an arrangement Achara and I had. I thanked her and walked away feeling sick to my stomach. That night, I confronted Achara, asked her directly if she was seeing other men. She exploded, actually screamed at me, said I was paranoid and controlling, and that if I didn't trust her, maybe we shouldn't be together. She accused me of listening to gossip from jealous bar girls who wanted to break us up because they were jealous she'd found a good man. She cried, real tears streaming down her face. Said she'd left the bar life for me, given up her independence, moved in with me, and this was how I repaid her. By accusing her based on bar girl gossip. I ended up apologizing to her. Actually apologized for asking a legitimate question about her fidelity, and she accepted my apology like I'd done something wrong, like I was the problem. That's how good she was. That's how completely she had me turned around. But I couldn't let it go entirely. So I did something I'm not proud of. I started keeping track of her. Not in an obvious way, just mental notes. When she said she was going somewhere, I'd remember where. Then I'd check later, casually, to see if details matched up. More often than not, they didn't. She'd say she went to Central Festival, but then mention a shop that wasn't there. She'd say she met her friend at a coffee shop in North Pattaya, but her friend would later mention meeting somewhere else entirely. Small inconsistencies. The kind you could explain away individually, but when you added them up, they painted a picture I didn't want to see. Graham started acting even stranger around this time. He'd suggested we grab dinner on a Tuesday evening, and I'd agreed. But when Tuesday came, he canceled via text, said something had come up. About an hour later, I was driving through Jomtien and I saw his car, parked outside a seafood restaurant where we often ate. I almost stopped, thought about going in to surprise him, see if he wanted company. But something made me hesitate. And that's when I saw Achara walk out. She was smiling, looking at her phone. Then Graham walked out behind her. They were together, having dinner together, the dinner he'd canceled with me to have with her. I sat in my car watching them. They weren't touching, weren't doing anything overtly romantic, but there was something about their body language, too comfortable, too familiar. Graham said something, and Achara laughed, that full body laugh she used to give me. Then they walked to his car. She got in the passenger side, and they drove off together. I called Graham immediately, asked him what he was up to. He said he was at home, working on his laptop. Boring night. I asked if he'd had dinner. He said he'd made a sandwich at home earlier. Every word a lie. Casual, confident lies. From my best friend. I hung up without saying anything else. Sat in my car for 30 minutes trying to process what I'd just seen. What it meant. What I was supposed to do about it. When Achara came home that night, around 10, I asked where she'd been. She said she'd been at a friend's house watching movies. I asked which friend. She said Molly. I asked what movie they'd watched. She gave me a title. I asked if she'd eaten dinner. She said they'd ordered pizza. Every answer came easily. No hesitation. She'd had hours to prepare her story. Or maybe she was just that good at lying. Maybe she'd been lying so long it had become natural. I didn't confront her. Not yet. Because I didn't have proof of anything except that she'd had dinner with my mate, which she could easily explain away as innocent. Graham was my friend, she'd say. We'd all spent time together. What was wrong with them getting dinner? I'd sound paranoid and jealous, and she'd use it against me, just like she had before. So I said nothing. just nodded along to her lies, and felt something die inside me. The next few weeks were torture. I knew something was happening. I could feel it. But I didn't have proof. And without proof, I couldn't act. So I watched. And I waited. And I died a little more each day. Achara continued her routine, going out for hours, coming back with vague explanations, being on her phone constantly, having sex with me while thinking about someone else. I could see it in her eyes. She wasn't present, hadn't been present for months. Graham avoided me almost entirely by December. We'd go 2 weeks without seeing each other. When I'd text him, he'd take hours or days to respond, always with excuses, always apologetic, but never actually making time. Our friendship, or what I'd thought was a friendship, had evaporated, and I was pretty sure I knew why. On Christmas Eve, Achara said she was going to visit her friend's family party in Jomtien. Said she'd be back by midnight. At 11:30, I was driving back from my own expat friend's Christmas gathering when I saw Graham's car again. This time parked outside a hotel in South Pattaya. Not a nice hotel. One of those cheap places people use for exactly one thing. I parked across the street and waited. At 12:15, they came out together. Graham and Achara. He had his arm around her waist. She was laughing at something he'd said. They kissed before getting in the car. Not a friendly kiss. A kiss between lovers. I followed them. Stupid thing to do, probably, but I wasn't thinking clearly. They drove to a condo building in Pratumnak. Not Graham's usual place. Maybe a friend's place they were using. Maybe somewhere he rented specifically for this. They went inside together. I sat outside for 2 hours. At 2:30 in the morning, I went home. Achara came through the door at 3, smelling like hotel soap and making excuses about the party running late. I listened to her lies and said nothing. Just went to bed. She curled up against me like she always did. Like she hadn't just spent the evening shagging my best mate. Like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. I didn't sleep that night. Or the next. I couldn't eat. I'd lost maybe half a stone in those few weeks just from stress. My stomach was constantly tight, like I had a fist permanently clenched in my gut. Every time my phone rang, I jumped. Every time Achara touched me, my skin crawled. But I still didn't confront either of them. Because somewhere in the back of my mind, I was hoping I was wrong. Hoping there was some explanation that would make all of this make sense. Even though I'd seen them. Even though I knew, some part of me still wanted to believe it wasn't real. The confrontation I'd been dreading came from an unexpected direction. On January 8th, Graham texted me saying we needed to talk. In person. It was important. I suggested the next day, and he agreed. We met at an outdoor bar on Beach Road, our usual spot. It was a Wednesday afternoon, not too crowded. He ordered a beer. I ordered a beer. And then he just started talking. He said he'd been seeing Achara since May, since shortly after I'd introduced them. He said it had started innocently enough, just messages online about what to get me for my birthday. But then the messages had become more frequent, more personal. They'd started meeting up for coffee, just as friends, he claimed. But then one day in June, they'd kissed. And after that, it had become physical, regular. Throughout the entire time she'd been living with me. He said he was telling me because he felt guilty, because our friendship meant too much to him to continue lying, because he couldn't keep pretending everything was fine when he was betraying me every time he saw her. He said he never meant for it to happen, that it just did. that they'd connected in a way he hadn't expected. He said she was going to leave me for him, that they'd discussed it, that she wanted to be with him, but she'd been afraid to tell me, afraid I'd be angry, afraid I'd kick her out with nowhere to go. I sat there listening to this confession, this unburdening of his guilty conscience, and I felt nothing. Or rather, I felt too much. Anger and betrayal and humiliation all fighting for space in my chest. But underneath it all was this terrible numbness. Like my body had decided feeling anything was too dangerous, so it had just shut down. I asked him how many times. He said he didn't know. Too many to count. Once or twice a week, sometimes more. I asked him where. He said his place, mostly. Sometimes hotels when they wanted more privacy. Sometimes in my condo when I was at meetings. In my bed. The bed I shared with her. I asked him why. Why would he do this to me? Why would he destroy our friendship for her? He said he didn't have a good answer. That he was sorry. That he knew sorry wasn't enough. That he'd understand if I never wanted to speak to him again. I sat there staring at him. This man I'd considered a brother. This man I'd trusted with everything. And I wanted to hit him. I wanted to smash my fist into his face. Watch his nose break. Make him hurt the way I was hurting. My hands were literally shaking with the need to hurt him. But I didn't, because violence wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't undo the betrayal. It wouldn't make her faithful. It wouldn't make him loyal. It would just be one more moment of loss of control in a situation where I'd already lost everything that mattered. Instead, I asked him if he loved her. He hesitated, then said he thought he might. I laughed, actually laughed. Told him he was an idiot if he thought what they had was real. Told him she was using him the same way she'd used me. That he was just another wallet to her, another comfortable life. And when someone better came along, she'd do to him exactly what she'd done to me. He got defensive then, said I was just bitter, that I didn't understand their connection, that what they had was different, that she'd told him she'd never felt this way about anyone. I laughed again, because I'd heard those exact words from her, those exact promises. She'd recycled the same script for both of us. I left Graham sitting at that bar. Didn't finish my beer. Didn't say goodbye. Just walked away. He called after me, but I didn't turn around. I got in my car and drove home. Achara was there, on the couch, watching something on her phone. She smiled when I came in, asked how my day was, and I lost it, completely lost it. Started yelling at her, asking her how she could do this, how she could sleep with my best friend, how she could look me in the eye every day, knowing what she was doing. She tried to deny it at first, said Graham was lying, that he was jealous of what we had, that he was trying to break us up. But I told her I'd seen them together, multiple times, at the restaurant, at the hotel. She went quiet then. That telltale quiet when someone's been caught, and they're trying to figure out what to say next. Then she switched tactics. Said yes, she'd been with Graham, but only because I was never there for her, because I worked too much, because I didn't understand what she needed, because Graham actually listened to her, actually cared about her feelings. It was textbook blame shifting. Make it my fault that she'd cheated. Make it my fault that she'd betrayed me with my best friend. And the worst part? Some small part of me actually wondered if she was right. If I had driven her to this, if I'd been a better partner, maybe she wouldn't have strayed. But then I remembered the timeline. They'd started in May, just weeks after I'd introduced them. before we'd had any problems, before any cracks had appeared in our relationship. She hadn't cheated because I'd failed her. She'd cheated because that's who she was. A woman who took what she wanted from whoever would give it to her with no regard for the damage she caused. I asked her if she loved him. She said she didn't know, said it was complicated, said she cared about both of us. I asked her to leave. She said this was her home too, that she'd lived here for 5 months, that she had rights. I told her she'd lost any rights the moment she'd brought another man into my bed. She started crying then, real tears, sobbing tears, saying she was sorry, that she'd made a mistake, that she wanted to stay with me, that she'd end things with Graham if I'd just give her another chance. And for maybe 5 seconds, I considered it. Considered letting her stay. Considered trying to forgive her. Because starting over felt impossible. Because admitting I'd been played felt humiliating. Because some pathetic part of me still wanted her. Still remembered how good it had felt when I'd believed the lies. But then I remembered Graham's face. The way he'd confessed like he'd done me a favor. The way he'd talked about their connection. And I told her to pack her things and get out. She left that night. Called Graham to pick her up, which felt like a final twist of the knife. I watched from my balcony as his car pulled up. Watched her get in with her suitcases. Watched them drive away together. And I felt something break inside me that I don't think will ever heal properly. Not just because she'd cheated, but because he had. Because two people I'd trusted completely had conspired together to betray me. Because I'd spent 11 months of my life being a joke and not knowing it. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't focus on work. Couldn't sleep. Would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment, looking for signs I'd missed. And there were so many. The way she'd started mentioning him more often. Asking what he liked, what his interests were. The way she'd always looked her best when she knew we were meeting him. The way they'd exchange glances when they thought I wasn't looking. It had all been there, right in front of me, and I'd been too blind to see it. Too confident that my girlfriend and my best friend would never betray me. I started reconstructing the timeline obsessively. Every time she'd said she was going out with friends, I now wondered if she'd been with him. Every night she'd come home late. Every weekend she'd had plans. Every moment she'd been on her phone smiling. Had it all been him? Had there been a single genuine moment in the last 11 months? Or had she been playing me from the start, from that very first night at the bar? The thing about betrayal like this is it doesn't just destroy the present. It destroys the past too. Every happy memory I had with her was now tainted. Every time I'd felt lucky to have her, every moment I'd believed we were building something real, it was all corrupted by the knowledge that she'd been lying, that she'd been with him, that while I'd been falling in love with her, she'd been calculating how to get the most out of both of us. I found out through a mutual friend that she'd moved in with Graham. Just moved straight from my place to his no transition period. It had probably been planned for weeks, maybe longer. Maybe they'd been discussing it every time they'd been together, laughing about how clueless I was, how easy it had been to deceive me. The confident alpha male too arrogant to imagine his girlfriend would cheat on him with his best friend. A couple of other expats reached out when word got around. Wanted to know if I was okay. Some were genuinely concerned. Others just wanted the gossip. One of them told me he'd seen Achara and Graham together months ago, looking cozy at a bar in Jomtien. Said he'd thought about telling me, but didn't want to get involved. Didn't want to be the messenger who got shot. I thanked him and said I understood. But inside I was furious. How many people had known? How many people had watched me being made a fool of and said nothing? My other friendships in the expat community took a hit too, because everyone had to choose sides, in a way. Some people stayed loyal to Graham, said it wasn't any of their business what had happened between us, that they liked both of us and didn't want to pick. Others cut ties with him immediately. Said what he'd done was unforgivable, that you don't betray your mates like that there are codes, lines you don't cross. The division was almost worse than the original betrayal, watching my social circle fragment because of their actions. I considered leaving Pattaya entirely, starting over somewhere else. Bangkok, maybe, or Chiang Mai. Somewhere I wouldn't run into them, wouldn't have to see them together, wouldn't have to be reminded constantly of what they'd done. But I'd built a life here, had a business, property, connections. Why should I be the one to leave? Why should I have to uproot my entire existence because they'd betrayed me? So I stayed. But it was hard, harder than I'd expected. I saw them together exactly once after she'd moved out. It was late February, about 6 weeks after everything had blown up. I was at a restaurant in North Pattaya having dinner with a friend. They walked in together, holding hands, laughing about something. They saw me immediately. The laughter stopped. Graham actually had the decency to look ashamed. Achara just looked through me like I wasn't there, like I'd never mattered. They didn't stay, turned around and left. Probably didn't want the awkwardness. Probably didn't want to face what they'd done. My friend asked if I was okay. I said I was fine. But I wasn't. Seeing them together, seeing her with him so soon after being with me, it brought everything back. The anger, the humiliation, the sense of worthlessness. If I'd been so easy to replace, what did that say about me? What did that say about what we'd had? Had I imagined the connection we'd shared? Had I invented the love I'd thought I'd felt from her? How could I trust my own judgment after being so spectacularly wrong? I found out later from someone who knew Graham that Achara had started asking him for money. Small amounts at first, then larger. She'd lost her job at the bar, she claimed. Her mother needed medical treatment. Her sister's school fees were due. All the same stories she'd told me. All the same excuses. And Graham was paying her, just like I had, because he believed he was special. Because he believed what they had was different. Because he thought she loved him. I wondered how long it would take before he realized what I'd realized too late. That she didn't love either of us. That she was incapable of that kind of love. That we were just resources to be exploited until something better came along. The worst thing about all of this wasn't the cheating itself. It was the double betrayal. If Achara had cheated with some random Thai guy, or even some random Farang I didn't know, it would have hurt. It would have been awful. But at least I'd still have had Graham. I'd have had my best mate to help me through it, to drink with and commiserate with, and slowly move past it. But he'd taken that away from me. He'd made sure I was alone. That when my relationship imploded, I'd have no one to turn to. That was the truly unforgivable part. Not just that he'd slept with my girlfriend, but that he'd destroyed both relationships simultaneously. left me with nothing. I've had time to think about it now, several months later. Time to gain some perspective. And I keep coming back to the same question. How did I not see it? How did I miss something so obvious? And the answer is uncomfortable. I didn't see it because I didn't want to, because my ego wouldn't let me. I was so confident in myself, in my ability to keep a young Thai girlfriend, in my friendship with Graham, that I couldn't imagine being betrayed by either of them, let alone both. That's the danger of overconfidence. It makes you blind. It makes you ignore warning signs because you believe you're immune. I'd thought I was smarter than the other Farangs getting played by bar girls. I'd thought I was above the typical expat drama. I'd thought my relationship was different. My girlfriend was different. My friendship was solid. And all of those assumptions made me vulnerable to exactly the kind of betrayal I'd thought I was too smart to fall for. If I could give advice to anyone in a similar situation, it would be this: trust your instincts. When something feels off, it usually is. Don't let your ego talk you out of investigating. Don't let your desire to believe someone override the evidence in front of you. And be very, very careful about the people you trust. Because sometimes the people closest to you are the ones who'll hurt you worst. Not because they're inherently evil, but because they have the access and the trust to do maximum damage. I'm still in Pattaya, still running my businesses, still living in the same condo where it all happened. I've redecorated, changed the furniture, tried to make it feel different. But some nights I still lie in bed and remember her lying there beside me. Remember believing her lies. Remember the last time we had sex, not knowing Graham had been there that same afternoon. The mental images don't fade as quickly as I'd like. I heard through the grapevine that Achara and Graham broke up about 4 months after she'd moved in with him. He'd found out she was seeing another Farang on the side. Some younger guy with more money. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. He'd done to Graham exactly what she'd done to me. And I would have felt vindicated if it hadn't all been so depressingly predictable. She was always going to do it. It's who she is. A woman who trades up whenever the opportunity presents itself, with no loyalty to anyone but herself. Graham tried to reach out to me after they broke up. Sent me a long message apologizing again, saying I'd been right, that he should have listened, that he understood now what kind of person she was, that he was sorry for throwing away our friendship. I read the message and didn't respond, because what was there to say? Sorry doesn't undo the damage. Sorry doesn't give me back the 11 months he spent shagging my girlfriend. Sorry doesn't rebuild the trust he destroyed. Some betrayals are too big to forgive, and this was one of them. I'm not the same person I was before all this happened. I'm more cynical now, more guarded. I don't trust as easily. I don't believe women when they tell me I'm different, I'm special. I know those are just words. And I've learned that male friendship, something I'd always thought was solid and reliable, can be just as fragile as romantic relationships. Maybe more so, because you don't expect it. You don't guard against it. Would I move back to England if I could? Probably not. Despite everything, I still prefer life here. The weather, the cost of living, the general lifestyle. But it's tainted now. Pattaya will always be the place where I got betrayed by the two people I trusted most, where I learned that confidence can be a fatal flaw, where I discovered I wasn't as smart as I thought I was, If you're reading this and you're in a similar situation, if you suspect your partner might be cheating with someone you know, someone you trust, don't ignore it. Don't rationalize it away. Don't tell yourself you're being paranoid. You're probably not. Cheating with a friend is more common than anyone wants to admit because friends have proximity. They have access. They have trust. And some people will exploit all of that without a second thought. And if your friend is acting strange, if they're avoiding you, if they're canceling plans, if they're uncomfortable around your girlfriend, pay attention. Those are signs. Your instincts are trying to tell you something. Listen to them. Because by the time you have concrete proof, the damage is already done. The betrayal has already happened. You're just catching up to reality. I don't know where Achara is now. Don't care, really. Last I heard, she'd moved on to another Farang, some retiree with more money than sense. Probably telling him the same stories she told me and Graham. Probably making him feel special and different. And he's probably falling for it, just like we did. Because that's the cycle. There's always another Mark. Always another guy who thinks he's got it figured out. Who thinks he won't make the mistakes other Farangs make. Graham still lives in Pattaya. We've never spoken again. Sometimes I see his car around town and feel nothing. No anger, no sadness, just emptiness. Like he's a stranger I used to know. In a way, that's exactly what he is. The person I was friends with for 23 years doesn't exist anymore. Maybe he never existed. Maybe I only knew the version of him he wanted me to see. The loyal friend, the trusted mate. And underneath that was someone capable of betraying me for months without hesitation. The anger has faded, mostly. What I'm left with is disappointment. In both of them, but mainly in myself. For being so blind, for being so arrogant, for thinking I was immune to the problems other expats faced. I wasn't. I was just as vulnerable, just as foolish, just as easy to deceive. That's a hard thing to accept about yourself, that you're not as sharp as you thought, that your judgment is flawed, that your confidence was misplaced. There's no happy ending to this story, no redemption arc, no moment where I came out stronger and better. I'm just older and more damaged, more aware of how fragile trust is, how easily people will throw away years of friendship or months of relationship for momentary pleasure. How little loyalty means when someone wants something badly enough. If there's a lesson in all this, it's simple. Don't be overconfident. Don't assume you're immune to betrayal. Don't trust people just because you've known them a long time or because they say the right things. Watch what they do, not what they say. And when your instincts tell you something is wrong, believe them because they're usually right. Your conscious mind might make excuses, might rationalize, might find reasons to doubt, but your gut knows. It always knows. I just wish I'd listened to mine sooner. To anyone out there who thinks their situation is different, who thinks their girlfriend or boyfriend wouldn't cheat, who thinks their friend would never betray them, I hope you're right. Genuinely. I hope you never have to go through what I went through. But if you do, don't make my mistake. Don't let your confidence blind you. Don't ignore the signs because admitting the truth is painful. Because finding out later, after months of lies and deception, is so much worse. My best mate of 23 years slept with my girlfriend for 11 months. And I didn't see it coming until he sat me down and confessed. That's not a story about their betrayal. That's a story about my blindness, about my arrogance, about my fatal assumption that I was somehow exempt from the laws that govern everyone else's relationships. I wasn't. I'm not. None of us are. And the sooner you accept that, the better chance you have of seeing betrayal before it destroys you. The psychological impact of this kind of betrayal is something I don't think people fully understand unless they've lived through it. It's not just about losing a girlfriend or losing a friend. It's about losing your sense of reality. Because if two people you trusted completely could deceive you so thoroughly, what does that say about your ability to judge character? What does that say about all your other relationships? Every interaction becomes suspect. Every friendly gesture might be hiding something. Every smile might be fake. That's what betrayal does. It doesn't just hurt you in the moment. It poisons everything that comes after. I've spoken to a therapist about it. Not something I ever thought I'd do. But after 3 months of barely sleeping and losing nearly 2 stone, I figured I needed help. She told me what I was experiencing was normal. That betrayal trauma, especially from multiple sources simultaneously, creates a kind of psychological damage that takes time to heal. She said, I'd been living in a state of cognitive dissonance for months. Part of me had known something was wrong, but another part refused to accept it because accepting it meant admitting I'd been fooled. That internal conflict, that constant state of knowing and not knowing simultaneously, had been eating away at my mental health without me realizing it. She asked me about my childhood, my previous relationships, my divorce, wanted to understand if there were patterns. And there were, I suppose. I've always been the kind of man who takes charge, who makes decisions, who's confident in my choices. That served me well in business, made me successful, made me money. But in personal relationships, it made me arrogant, made me dismissive of concerns or doubts, made me steamroll over my own instincts because I believed I knew better. My ex-wife had tried to tell me I didn't listen, that I made assumptions and never questioned them. I'd thought she was just being difficult. Turns out she was right. The therapist also helped me understand the rage I felt. Because it wasn't just anger. It was a deep, visceral fury that I'd never experienced before. I'd lie in bed at night, imagining confrontations that would never happen, imagining telling them both exactly what I thought of them, imagining Graham's face when I'd refused to forgive him, imagining Achara realizing she'd lost someone who genuinely cared about her. But those fantasies never satisfied the rage. They just fed it, made it grow. Until I was spending hours each day just replaying scenarios in my head, just stewing in anger that had nowhere to go. The therapist said that was normal too. That betrayal, especially from people you love, triggers a primal response. That humans are wired to respond to betrayal with rage because historically, being betrayed by your tribe could get you killed. That the intensity of my anger wasn't a personal failing, it was biology. That didn't make it easier to live with, but it helped to understand it wasn't just me being crazy or vindictive. It was my brain trying to protect me from future harm by making me hyper-aware of every potential threat. What surprised me most about the therapy was realizing how much of my identity had been wrapped up in these relationships. I'd thought of myself as a man who had it all figured out, who'd successfully rebuilt his life after divorce, who'd found love again in an unexpected place, who had solid friendships that would last forever. And when those relationships imploded, so did that identity. I didn't know who I was anymore. I was just this angry, suspicious shell of a person who didn't trust anyone, including himself. Rebuilding from that kind of ground zero is harder than starting fresh ever was, because you're not just building a new life. You're trying to figure out who you even are when everything you believed about yourself has been proven wrong. I'd thought I was perceptive. I wasn't. I'd thought I was a good judge of character. I wasn't. I'd thought I understood loyalty and friendship. I didn't. Every foundational belief I'd had about myself and my place in the world had been shattered. And I had to somehow pick up those pieces and construct something new from them. The practical aspects of moving on were almost easier than the psychological ones. I changed my phone number so Achara couldn't contact me, deleted all our photos from my phone and computer, packed away anything she'd given me or left behind, bought new bed sheets because I couldn't stand sleeping on the ones we'd shared. Small, concrete actions that felt like progress, even when emotionally I was still stuck in the same place. I also changed some of my routines, started going to different restaurants and bars, places Graham and I had never frequented together, places I wouldn't risk running into them. It felt like I was hiding, in a way, like I was letting them drive me out of spaces I'd enjoyed. But the alternative, constantly being on edge wondering if they'd walk in, was worse. So I created a new Pattaya for myself, one without shared memories, one where I could exist without constantly being reminded of what I'd lost. The dating situation became complicated too, because I wanted to meet someone new, wanted to prove to myself that I could still form connections. But I was too damaged to actually follow through. I'd match with women on dating apps, start conversations, then immediately start looking for red flags, analyzing every word they typed for signs of manipulation or dishonesty. It was exhausting and unfair to them. They weren't Achara. They weren't deceiving me, but I couldn't turn off the paranoia. Couldn't stop myself from assuming everyone had ulterior motives. One woman I went on a few dates with, a nice Filipina who worked in hotel management, actually called me out on it, said I was interrogating her rather than getting to know her, that she felt like I was waiting for her to fail some test rather than just enjoying her company. She was right. I was. I apologized and tried to explain about the betrayal, but she'd already decided I was too much baggage. Can't blame her. Who wants to date someone who can't trust anyone? Who sees threats and deception everywhere? I wouldn't want to date me either. My business relationships changed too. I'd always been fairly trusting with my local business partners. Thai guys I'd worked with for years. Good relationships, no problems. But after everything with Achara and Graham, I started questioning those relationships too. Started wondering if they were being honest with me about financials. Started double-checking things I'd never questioned before. One of my partners noticed and asked if there was a problem. If I didn't trust him anymore, I had to apologize and explain it wasn't personal, that I was going through something. But the damage was done. That relationship's never been quite the same since. That's the thing about betrayal. It's not contained. It spreads. It infects everything. Every relationship, every interaction, every moment of vulnerability becomes a potential threat. You become your own worst enemy because you can't trust yourself to read situations accurately. If you couldn't see it when your best friend was shagging your girlfriend for nearly a year, how can you trust yourself to see anything? How can you trust any judgment you make about anyone? I've thought a lot about Graham specifically. Uh, about what kind of person does that to a friend. And I've come to realize he probably justified it to himself. Probably told himself I didn't really love Achara the way he did, or that she wasn't happy with me, or that I'd understand eventually, or that our friendship would survive. Whatever story he needed to tell himself to make it okay to betray someone who'd trusted him completely. People are good at that, at creating narratives that excuse their own behavior, at making themselves the hero or the victim of their own stories rather than the villain. The confession itself still bothers me. Not just that he did it, but how he did it. Sitting me down like he was doing me a favor. Like telling me after 11 months of lies was somehow noble. Like his guilt and his need to feel better were more important than the pain it would cause me. That's narcissism at its core. Making his emotional need to confess more important than my need to not have my world destroyed. If he'd really cared about me, he'd have ended it with Achara immediately when it started. Or never started it at all. The confession wasn't for my benefit. It was for his. So he could stop carrying the guilt. So he could feel like an honest person again. But what about me? What about the months I'd spent being deceived? Did those not matter? And Achara's role in all this is interesting too, because she had to actively choose, every single day, to deceive me. Had to look me in the eye and lie. Had to kiss me knowing she'd kissed him earlier. Had to have sex with me while thinking about him. That takes a certain kind of cold calculation, a certain disconnect from empathy. I don't think she's evil. I think she's just fundamentally self-interested. And in her worldview, managing multiple relationships was just smart strategy, diversifying her assets, making sure she'd always have somewhere to land. What I can't figure out is whether she ever cared about me at all. Were there any real feelings underneath the performance? Or was it all just an act from day one? I'll probably never know. And maybe it doesn't matter. Because even if some part of what we had was real, she still chose to betray it. Still chose Graham over me. Or rather, chose both of us over being honest with either of us. That's not love. That's not even basic respect. That's just using people as resources until they're no longer useful. The expat community in Pattaya has been a mixed bag through all this. Some guys have been genuinely supportive, checked in on me, invited me to things, made sure I wasn't isolating completely. Others have been judgmental. The I told you so crowd, who act like they'd never fall for a bar girl's lies. Like they're somehow smarter or more immune. Those guys irritate me the most because they're one bad day away from being exactly where I am. They just haven't met their Achara yet, or their Graham. There's also been the gossip. Pattaya expat community is small enough that everyone knows everyone's business. My story has been told and retold, probably embellished along the way. I'm sure some versions paint me as the fool who should have known better. Others probably paint Achara as the villain and Graham as the snake. I try not to care what people are saying, but it's hard when you know your private pain has become public entertainment. One thing that's helped unexpectedly is talking to other guys who've been through similar betrayals. Not necessarily the friend sleeping with girlfriend scenario, but betrayal generally. Infidelity, lying, financial fraud. The mechanics differ, but the emotional impact is remarkably similar. That sense of having been played, of feeling stupid, of not knowing how to trust again. Knowing I'm not alone in that experience helps, makes it feel less like a personal failing and more like a common human experience. Doesn't fix anything, but it makes it easier to carry. I've also had to confront some uncomfortable truths about myself, about why I was so easy to deceive. Part of it was arrogance, yes, but part of it was also loneliness. I'd been divorced for years before meeting Achara. Had plenty of casual relationships, but nothing serious. And when she came along and made me feel wanted, feel desired, feel like I mattered to someone, I latched onto that. I overlooked red flags because I didn't want to be alone again. That's a hard thing to admit. That my need for companionship made me vulnerable to manipulation. That I was so afraid of being lonely that I accepted a lie rather than face the
Truth.
The same thing probably applied to Graham. He'd always been the confirmed bachelor, playing the field, never settling down. But maybe he was lonely too. Maybe when Achara showed interest in him, he convinced himself it was special, that it was worth betraying his friend for. That's not an excuse. There is no excuse. But it might be an explanation. Lonely people do stupid things, make terrible decisions, hurt people they care about. Because in that moment, their need feels more important than anyone else's feelings. I've learned to be more honest about my own loneliness, to acknowledge it rather than covering it up with bravado and confidence, to understand that needing people doesn't make you weak, but trying to fill that need with people who aren't genuine does make you vulnerable. The trick, I suppose, is finding people who are actually worthy of trust. But how do you do that when you can't trust your own judgment? That's the catch-22 of betrayal trauma. You need connection to heal, but you're too damaged to risk connection. Time helps, supposedly. That's what everyone says. It's been 9 months now since Graham's confession. 16 months since she moved in with me. Nearly 2 years since we met. And I'm better than I was. I can sleep most nights. I can eat normally. I don't spend every waking moment obsessing over what happened, but I'm not healed. I'm just functional. There's a difference. Healing implies restoration, implies becoming whole again. I'm not sure that's possible after this kind of betrayal. I think you just learn to function around the damage. Like a broken bone that heals crooked. It works, but it's never quite the same. My family back in England has been supportive, though they don't fully understand. My sister keeps asking when I'm going to move back home, get away from Thailand and all its complications. But running away doesn't solve anything. The damage is in my head, not in my location. I'd carry it with me wherever I went. At least here I have a life, even if it's been tainted by what happened. At least here I have my businesses and routines, and some semblance of normalcy. My ex-wife reached out when she heard what had happened. Someone must have told her. We hadn't spoken in years. She said she was sorry, that she knew what betrayal felt like, that if I ever wanted to talk, she was available. I appreciated the gesture, but didn't take her up on it. We'd hurt each other enough during our marriage. Dredging all that up wouldn't help either of us, but it was kind of her to reach out. More kindness than I'd shown her toward the end of our marriage. The financial aspect of all this has been negligible. Surprisingly, Achara took some money from me over the 16 months. Sure. A few £1,000s total. Money I'd given her for her family, for clothes, for this or that emergency. But compared to what some guys lose, it was nothing. I've heard horror stories of men losing hundreds of thousands to Thai girlfriends, buying houses they can't own, sending money for years. I got off light in that regard. The real cost wasn't financial. It was psychological, emotional, the kind of cost you can't measure in currency. I've wondered sometimes if I should have seen it coming with Graham specifically. Were there signs earlier in our friendship? Times when he'd been less than honest or loyal? But I can't think of any. For 23 years, he was exactly who I thought he was. A solid mate, reliable, trustworthy. Until suddenly he wasn't. That's what's so disorienting about it. There's no clear moment where things changed. No warning. Just a friend who did something unforgivable and destroyed everything we'd built. The worst nights are the ones where I dream about it. Not nightmares exactly. Just dreams where everything's fine. Where Achara's still with me, still loving, still faithful. Where Graham and I are still friends, still meeting for beers, still laughing together. And then I wake up and remember it's not real, that it never was real. Those mornings are brutal. Having to remember all over again that I was betrayed. Having to face the reality that the life I thought I had was fiction. But I'm still here, still in Pattaya, still running my businesses, still getting up every morning and putting one foot in front of the other. That's something, I suppose. I haven't given up entirely, haven't let them destroy me completely. Though there are days when it feels close. Days when the anger and sadness and bitterness threaten to swallow me whole. But I push through because what's the alternative? Let them win? Let their betrayal define the rest of my life. I won't give them that power. I'm 59 years old. I thought I had life figured out. Thought I knew how to read people. Thought I understood relationships. Turns out I didn't know anything at all. That's a harsh lesson to learn this late in life. But better late than never, I suppose. At least now I know. Now my eyes are open. Now I see things clearly. I just wish it hadn't cost me so much to learn. But that's the price of wisdom, I suppose. It's always bought with pain, always paid for in pieces of yourself that you'll never get back. I've paid my price, learned my lesson. Now, I just have to figure out how to live with it.